In the winter of 1944, when the world was already drowning in blood and fire, a different kind of battle erupted far from the front lines. It did not begin with artillery or aircraft. It began with a slap, with a word, with a humiliation deliberately inflicted by men who wore the same uniform as those fighting in Europe, but who carried in their hearts a war of their own, a war to keep other human beings beneath them. The night was cold, the kind of damp chill that eats through wool uniforms and finds its way into the bones. Outside, the base lights glowed in the distance, casting pale halos over the barracks and vehicles. Inside a drafty canteen near a Canadian camp in Britain, tension crackled in the air more sharply than the static on the radio. Black American GIs, exhausted from weeks of training and work, stepped in to buy a drink, to relax for just a moment, to feel like human beings in a world that kept reminding them they were not. They had seen death, they had loaded bombs, driven trucks, repaired aircraft, and marched under the same flag as every other American soldier. But tonight, as on so many nights before, they were about to be reminded that their country still saw them as less. White American military policemen stood near the entrance, eyes already narrowed. They watched the black soldiers as if they were criminals crossing an invisible line. In their voices there was no brotherhood, no shared cause, no sense that they were all part of the same army fighting the same enemy. There was only possession, control, contempt. Hey you know the rules, one MP barked, stepping in front of a black GI who had almost reached the bar. You're not allowed in here. Coloreds drink in the back. The Canadian bartender froze, his hand hovering over a bottle. He glanced from the white MP to the black soldier, then to the Canadian insignia on his own chest. The room grew quieter, conversations dimming as eyes shifted. The black GI, his name stitched neatly over his heart, swallowed hard. He had heard those words back home. In bus stations. On street corners. Outside schools he could never attend. But here, with bombs falling over Europe and men dying by the thousands, he had hoped, if only for a moment, that things could be different. "Sergeant," he said, carefully respectful, "we've been invited here by the Canadians." The bartender said. The white MP cut him off, stepping closer, his voice low and sharp. "I don't care what they said. You people have your place. You stay in it." The black GI's jaw tightened. Every instinct told him to back down. He knew what could happen if he didn't. Confinement. Beatings. Worse. He could be written up for insubordination, assault, anything they wanted. But something about being told he had a place, when men like him were dying in Italy, in the Pacific, in France, clawed at him from inside. "We're wearing the same uniform as you," he replied, quietly but firmly. "We're soldiers. We're fighting the same war as you." The MP smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Only cruelty. "You might be wearing the same uniform," he said, "but don't you ever forget, you're not the same as us." He shoved the black GI hard in the chest. The soldier stumbled back into another black private behind him. A chair scraped violently against the floor. A bottle knocked over and shattered. Heads turned. The tension snapped. Another MP moved in, his baton already out. "Get out," he shouted. "All of you. Now." The black GIs hesitated. Some began to retreat, their faces tight with anger, humiliation, and a deep, weary resignation that had become far too familiar. Others stood rooted to the spot, their fists clenching, their breaths coming faster. One of them whispered, almost to himself but loud enough to be heard nearby, "We cross an ocean to fight Nazis and we still gotta bow to this." The words hung in the air like a challenge. A Canadian corporal at a nearby table rose slowly, the maple leaf on his sleeve catching the light. He had watched the scene unfold from the first word. He had seen the shove, heard the insults, felt the deep wrongness in his gut. "Sergeant," the Canadian called out, his voice even but edged with steel, "they're our guests. They're welcome here." The white MP turned his head, eyes narrowing at the Canadian. "This is an American matter," he replied. "Don't stick your nose in it." But the Canadian did not sit down. He was not alone now. Other Canadians were watching, standing, closing ranks. What had begun as one man stepping forward was now a line of uniforms rising, one by one, as if pulled by the same invisible string of conscience. "They're not just Americans," another Canadian said quietly. "They're soldiers. That makes them brothers." The MP's lip curled. "You don't decide how we handle our colored troops," he snapped. "We do. They know the rules. Segregation. That's the way it is." Inside the black GIs, something twisted. To hear the words spoken out loud here in a foreign land as if it were normal, as if it were righteous, lit a fire so old it felt ancestral. Generations of silence and suffering pressed behind their teeth, begging to be released. The senior black NCO among them, a staff sergeant who had spent his whole life learning when to bite his tongue in order to survive, stepped forward. His voice trembled, not with fear, but with the effort of holding back everything he wanted to scream. "With respect, Sergeant," he said to the MP, "we have followed every order, done every job you didn't want to do, and bled the same red on the same ground. We are not going to be treated like trash in front of our allies." People could hear his words. They felt them. The MP stepped closer, inches from his face. "You don't tell me what you are," he said. "I tell you." The slap came fast, open-handed, a crack that cut through the room like gunfire. The staff sergeant's head snapped to the side. A glass fell and shattered. Someone gasped. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. Black GIs surged forward, not as an organized unit, but as men who had been pushed too far for too long. White MPs raised their batons, their faces flushed with anger and shock. A chair flew crashing into a table. Voices exploded into shouting, accusations, raw fury. The bartender ducked, shouting for calm, but his voice was lost in the storm. The Canadian corporal shoved his table aside, stepping between the swinging batons and the black soldiers, throwing out an arm as if to create a barrier. "Enough," he shouted. "They've done nothing wrong. You're the one starting trouble." An MP turned on him, livid. "Back off, Canadian. This doesn't concern you." But it did. It concerned every man in that room who claimed to be fighting for freedom and justice while watching injustice unfold right in front of them. The fight spilled out of the canteen doors and into the cold night air. Boots pounded across the muddy ground. More MPs arrived, some already primed with the ugly assumption that if there was trouble, it had to be the Black GIs' fault. They moved to club, to drag, to control, but they weren't the only ones moving. Canadians who had seen enough of the confrontation joined in, not with fists but with bodies, placing themselves between the MPs and the black soldiers, blocking blows, shouting back, demanding explanations. "What are you doing?" one Canadian lieutenant yelled, grabbing an MP's arm mid-swing. "You can't treat men like this." "They're colored," the MP spat. "They don't know their place unless you show them." That sentence, that single sentence, echoed in the cold air like a confession of something rotten. Later, reports would be written and rewritten. Statements would be crafted, softened, sliced apart. But among the Black GIs, among the Canadians who saw it, the memory of that night would remain crystal clear. A night when men who called themselves military police humiliated soldiers whose only crime was being black. A night when allies stared at each other, divided not by language or nationality, but by a cruel American color line dragged across foreign soil. Rumors traveled quickly in wartime. They slipped between tents and across mess halls, whispered in the dim light of barracks and the shadows of motor pools. Within hours, Canadian officers knew. Within hours, Black American units knew. Within hours, the story began to make its way up another chain of command, one that would not shrug and say, "That's just the way things are." For at the top of the Canadian Army stood a man who had watched fascism rise in Europe, who had seen what happened when people decided some lives were worth less than others. His name was Harry Crerar, and when this story reached him, something in him reacted with cold, deliberate fury. Crerar was not a man given to theatrics. He was not a commander who relied on bombast or drama for effect. He was quiet, composed, methodical, the kind of leader who weighed each decision with the knowledge that it might cost lives. But he also understood something fundamental. The moral authority of an army depended on more than its weapons. It depended on what it allowed in its ranks. When the reports first landed on his desk, they were vague. Altercation between American MPs and colored troops. Minor disturbance in a canteen. Some Canadian involvement. But there were details that could not be buried under bureaucratic language. Black American soldiers had been denied service in a Canadian facility where they had been explicitly welcomed. They had been ordered out solely because of their race. They had been insulted, shoved, struck. American MPs had tried to enforce segregation on Canadian soil. Canadian soldiers had stepped in and clashed with the MPs. It was not just a fight. It was a challenge to the values Canada claimed to fight for. Crerar read and reread and then called for more. He did not trust the first round of reports, especially those written by men who might want to protect careers or alliances, or their own sense of power. He demanded statements from Canadian officers present. From enlisted men. From the Black GIs if they were willing to speak. He did not want hearsay. He wanted facts. The more he read, the colder he became. Here was a black staff sergeant describing the humiliation of being slapped in front of allies after serving faithfully for years. Here was a Canadian corporal describing MPs calling black soldiers, "you people," and insisting they remember their place. Here was a Canadian officer affirming that the black troops had behaved properly until they were provoked and assaulted. Here were details of MPs insisting that segregation was the American way, and that it applied wherever they went. Crerar stared at those words for a long time. The American way. Those words meant nothing to him when they were used as justification for humiliation. Canada had its own injustices, its own sins, its own hypocrisies. He knew that. He knew his country was no paradise. But he also knew this. He would not allow a foreign army to import its racial system and impose it on Canadian soil without consequence. Outside his office, the war roared on. Men died in Italy, in the skies over Germany, on the beaches and in the forests of Europe. The big picture demanded his attention every hour of every day. But this clash in a canteen, this insult thrown in the face of black soldiers by white MPs, had become part of that big picture for him. Because what was the point of fighting Hitler if, behind the lines, men defending freedom were allowed to imitate the logic of the enemy? What was the meaning of the word, allies, if one ally treated another's soldiers as lesser because of the color of their skin? The answer formed in his mind with frightening clarity. There would be no American-style segregation in Canadian camps. There would be no humiliation of black soldiers under his command, whether they were Canadian or American. There would be no doubt anywhere in his army about where he stood. He summoned his staff. The room filled with officers, their faces lined with exhaustion, their uniforms bearing the visible pressures of a war that had already dragged on too long. They expected orders about troop movements, logistics, supply problems. Instead, they heard something else. Crerar's voice did not rise. It did not need to. It was precise, cutting, and laced with a quiet anger that made men sit up straighter. "We have received reports," he began, "of American military police attempting to enforce racial segregation on our bases. They have humiliated black American soldiers in Canadian facilities. They have tried to deny them equal treatment on our soil. This is unacceptable." He let the word hang. "Unacceptable," he repeated softly, and in that softness there was something like a threat. One of his staff officers shifted slightly. "Sir, the Americans." "The Americans," Crerar interrupted, "are our allies. We fight beside them. We value that alliance. But we do not surrender our principles. Canada does not enforce segregation. We will not begin doing so now because another nation demands it." He turned his gaze deliberately from one face to another, as if he wanted each man to remember this moment years from now. "There will be a directive," he said. "It will be clear. It will be enforced. I want it prepared immediately." He began dictating, each phrase chosen like a round loaded into a chamber. "There is to be no discrimination in the provision of recreation, accommodation, or service to American troops on the basis of race." He paused, then spoke slower. "Black American soldiers are to be treated in all respects as equal to white American soldiers while on Canadian bases." He looked up. "Any attempt by American authorities to enforce segregation in Canadian camps is to be reported to us at once. We will not obey such orders. And we will protect the men being targeted." The officers around him understood. This was not just a memo. It was a line in the sand. "Sir," one ventured cautiously, "the Americans may not take kindly to this. Their MPs, their commanders." Crerar did not flinch. "They may not take kindly to it," he replied. "That is their problem. This is ours. Are we the kind of nation that looks away when men are humiliated because of the color of their skin? Or are we the kind that stands up and says, 'Not here. Not under our flag'?" He did not raise his voice. But the effect was the same as if he had slammed a fist on the table. Outside, trucks rumbled past. Somewhere, a radio played a swing tune. Somewhere, a teleprinter rattled out casualty figures. The war did not pause for this conversation. But inside that room, a decision was made that would reverberate through the hearts of black soldiers who had grown used to being betrayed by those in power. The directive went out. It flashed across signals networks, traveled by courier, appeared on notice boards and in orders groups. Canadian commanders read it, some with quiet pride, some with apprehension, all with clarity. There would be no segregation in Canadian units or camps. Period. Within hours the effect was felt. In a canteen not far from where the first humiliation had taken place, a group of black American GIs entered cautiously, their bodies tense, expecting trouble. They had heard a rumor, something about the Canadians going to bat for them. But they had heard promises before. Words meant very little when batons began to swing. The Canadian officer on duty that night stood at the entrance watching them come in. His expression was neutral, but his eyes were kind. He stepped forward, and for a second the GIs stiffened, bracing for the familiar script, the order to leave, the reminder of their place. But the words that came out of his mouth were different. "Evening, gentlemen," he said. "Glad to have you. You're welcome here." The black soldiers exchanged quick glances, half disbelieving. "Sir," one ventured carefully, "we were told the MPs." The officer shook his head. "This is a Canadian facility," he replied. "On Canadian soil. Our commander has made it clear. There is no segregation here. If anyone has a problem with you being here, tell them to come see me. Or better yet, tell them to read their orders." For a moment no one moved. The weight of that sentence, of that simple fact, "there is no segregation here," settled on their shoulders like a cloak they had never known existed. Not a burden but a protection. Fragile maybe. Temporary maybe. But real. Slowly they stepped inside. The room did not go silent. Canadian soldiers continued playing cards, drinking, laughing. Some glanced up, offering nods, small smiles, gestures that said, "You belong here as much as we do." One Canadian private, who had grown up in a small town and had barely seen a black face before the war, raised his glass toward them, as if to test his own courage along with theirs. "Evening, boys," he said. "Pull up a chair." It was such a small thing. A few words. A gesture. A place at the table. But for men used to being pushed aside, shoved out, made to feel less than human, it was enormous. Across the road, a pair of American MPs watched, their faces tight. They had received orders too, from their own chain of command. Orders that said segregation was to be enforced. Orders that told them they were in charge of discipline among black troops, which often turned out to mean discipline through intimidation. One of them muttered under his breath, "This is wrong." The other glared. Orders are orders. But for the first time, those orders collided head-on with another set of orders. Orders from a general they did not serve but whose authority they could not simply ignore. Word spread rapidly through black units. "Did you hear? Canadians don't let the MPs segregate their places." They threw it right back at them. Said, "Not in our army. In their canteens we can sit wherever we want." Stories grew as stories do, but underneath the exaggeration was something hard and solid. A fact. The truth. There was at least one place in this war where black soldiers could walk into a room and not immediately be told they did not belong. One black GI, writing in a letter he was not sure would ever make it past the censors, tried to describe how it felt. "I walked into that Canadian hall," he wrote, hands shaking slightly as he clutched his pencil, "and for the first time since putting on this uniform I didn't feel like a problem. I just felt like a soldier. Like a man." He hesitated, then added a line he knew might never see the eyes of his family, but that he needed to put on paper anyway. "They say we're fighting for freedom," he wrote. "Tonight, for a few hours, I actually tasted what that might mean." Back in Canadian headquarters, American officers began to complain. They came politely at first, wrapped in the language of alliance and protocol. "General Crerar," one American colonel said in a tense meeting, "this policy of yours is causing confusion among our troops. Our system, our regulations regarding colored soldiers are different from yours. We'd appreciate some flexibility." Crerar listened. "Your system," he repeated. "Your regulations." He folded his hands. "This is Canadian territory," he said. "Our bases. Our men. While your soldiers are under our operational control and on our ground, they will not be segregated in our facilities." The American shifted in his seat. "With respect," he replied, "our MPs have authority over our troops. They have instructions on how to maintain discipline among colored units. If they cannot enforce our rules, we may have difficulties." Crerar's gaze did not waver. "If your difficulties," he said calmly, "require the humiliation of loyal soldiers because of their race, then I regret that we cannot assist you in maintaining them." He leaned forward slightly. "Let me be absolutely clear," he continued. "Any attempt by your MPs to forcibly remove black soldiers from Canadian canteens, barracks, or recreational facilities will be treated as a breach of our authority. We will not tolerate it. Your men are guests here. That includes your MPs." The room seemed to shrink around them. The American colonel drew in a slow breath. "General, we don't want an incident." "Then do not cause one," Crerar said quietly. There was no shouting. No slammed doors. Only the kind of silence that falls when two visions of the world collide and neither side is willing to yield completely. Privately, some Canadian officers wondered how far their commander would go. Would he really confront the Americans directly if they pushed? Would he risk a diplomatic rupture in the middle of the war over this? The answer came not in another speech but in a series of small, decisive acts. In one camp, when American MPs tried to set up white-only nights at a shared facility, the Canadian CO shut the building down entirely for that evening rather than allow segregation. In another, when Black GIs were told by MPs that they couldn't use the front entrance to a hall, a Canadian major physically walked them in through that very door, daring anyone to challenge him. "They'll have to drag me out with them," he said quietly to one of his sergeants. "And I don't think they'll like how that looks in the papers." In yet another camp, a clash that might have turned violent ended abruptly when a Canadian officer stepped between an MP and a black soldier, pointed directly at the MP's chest, and said in a low, controlled voice, "Read your orders. You don't give commands here. We do." These were not grand gestures meant for history books. They were decisions made in seconds, under pressure, by men who knew that the easy path was silence. The black soldiers noticed. Every time a Canadian stepped up, every time someone in authority refused to look away, it carved a memory into their minds that would last long after the war ended. One night, in a dim barracks, a Black GI sat on his bunk, staring at the floor. Another soldier sat beside him. "You all right?" the second asked quietly. The first man sighed. "Just thinking," he murmured. "Back home they tell us to be proud, to fight, to be grateful for the chance to serve. But these last years, all I've seen is how little they think of us. How quickly they turn on us. How we're good enough to die but not good enough to sit at a table." He looked up, eyes glinting with something between anger and sorrow. "And then these Canadians." He shook his head. "These men I've never met before this war. They see us getting treated like dirt and they say, 'Not here.' They put it in writing. They stick their necks out. Makes you wonder who your real friends are." The second soldier nodded slowly. "It hurts, doesn't it?" he said softly. "To realize the people who should have had your back all along, didn't. And strangers had to step in." The first GI swallowed hard. "Yeah," he whispered. "It does. Not every Canadian was a hero. Not every interaction was perfect. Racism did not vanish overnight, and Canada had its own dark chapters that would not be fully faced for decades. But in this narrow, crucial slice of the war, something unambiguous had happened. A line had been drawn. And on one side of it, Harry Crerar stood. To some, this was just an internal policy dispute. To Black GIs, it was something else entirely, proof that their humanity was not negotiable everywhere. That somewhere, someone with real power had looked at their suffering and decided to do something about it. Stories grew over time. Some remembered Crerar as a fiery crusader, standing up in front of Americans and openly denouncing segregation in dramatic speeches. Others remembered quieter moments, a handshake, a nod, a sentence passed down the ranks. "The general says they're to be treated like any other soldiers." History sometimes smooths out these rough edges, but beneath the myths, one truth remains. Within 24 hours of learning what American MPs had done to Black GIs in that canteen, Crerar did not just send a message. He unleashed a policy that pulverized any attempt to enforce segregation in Canadian-controlled spaces. He turned what could have been another forgotten humiliation into a line of resistance written into orders, reinforced by officers, and lived out in mess halls and barracks. And the Americans noticed. Some resented it, grumbled that the Canadians were meddling in things they didn't understand. Others, quietly ashamed, welcomed the fact that someone had the courage to do what they themselves felt unable to. One white American officer, who had long felt sick watching his own army humiliate black soldiers, confessed in a letter he never sent, "The Canadians shamed us. Without speeches. Without fanfare. Simply by refusing to do what we have done for years without question. They made our color line look smaller, meaner, in the middle of a big war." The Black GIs, for their part, would carry those memories home. Years later, a veteran would sit on a porch in the humid American South, his grandchildren gathered at his feet. They would ask him about the war, about battles, about famous generals. But he would talk about something else. "I remember," he would say slowly, "one night when some American MPs thought they could push us around in front of Canadians. They slapped one of us. Tried to throw us out. Told us to go around back." His eyes would drift to a place very far away. "And then," he would continue, his voice softening, "those Canadians stepped in. And their general, a man named Crerar, sent word down that we were to be treated just like any other soldiers on their bases. No more back doors. No more separate nights. For the first time in uniform, I felt like a man someone in power was willing to stand up for." He would pause, letting the words sink in. You want to know what made me cry years after the war? He might say, his voice breaking just a little. Not the bombs. Not the shells. Not the friends I lost. It was remembering that feeling of walking into a place and not having anyone tell me I was less. Just once. Just for a little while. History is often told through maps and dates, through generals and operations, through victories and defeats measured in territory and tonnage. But beneath that, there is another layer, a war of dignity, of respect, of who is allowed to stand upright and who is forced to bow. In that quieter war, Harry Crerar fought a battle that did not make headlines, did not feature in official communiques, did not appear on the front pages. But for the men whose lives it touched, it mattered as much as any hill or crossroads. You can picture it even now. A canteen lit by yellow bulbs. Canadian and American uniforms mingling. The clink of glasses. The murmur of voices. And among them, a group of Black GIs, sitting where they choose, laughing a little too loud because they are not used to this feeling. At the door, an American MP hesitates, his hand resting on his baton. He looks at the orders pinned to the wall. He hears the Canadian officer's quiet words in his memory, "On this base they're just soldiers. Same as any of us." He lets his hand fall away from the baton and steps back into the night. Far away, in a headquarters lit by a single lamp, a general signs another document, moves another unit, plans another operation. His pen scratches across the page, sending men into danger. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he knows that not all battles are fought with bombs and bullets. Some are fought with a simple, unwavering refusal to accept that some men are worth less than others. And in that battle, on that front, Crerar had already chosen his side. The humiliation of Black GIs that night could have been buried, forgotten, written off as regrettable, but unavoidable. Instead, it sparked something else, a quiet rebellion inside the Allied camp against the poison of segregation. Black soldiers walked a little straighter on Canadian bases after that. Not because racism had disappeared, but because for once, the weight of it had been slightly lifted by someone other than themselves. They knew the war would end. They knew that when they went home, they would return to a country that still saw them as less. They knew that the welcome they received would not match the sacrifices they had made. But they also knew this: there had been a time, a place, and a man who had looked at them and seen not a problem, not a category, not a color, but soldiers. And sometimes, when the memories of battle grew dim and the names of famous generals blurred together, that is the memory that burned brightest. The night the Canadians said no. The day a commander wrote into orders what others only whispered. The moment an army decided that, in its house, segregation had no place. Because in a world tearing itself apart over who belonged and who did not, that simple act of defiance carried a force all its own. Not the force of guns and tanks. But the force of a different kind of power. The power to say, in the face of cruelty dressed as regulation, "Not here. Not under our flag. Not to our brothers." That was what Crerar ordered. And in less than 24 hours, Canadians across the theater turned that order into reality, pulverizing segregation not with speeches, but with doors held open, chairs pulled out, and 1,000 quiet acts of courage that told Black GIs, "You are not alone. You are not invisible. You are not less. Not here. Not tonight. Not ever again if we can help it."